What I'm going to do today is talk about realism. I'm hoping to get through the first generation and be able to start on, that's topic 4, but I'm hoping to be able to start on topic 5, if that's possible. I always enjoy when we reach this point where I get to talk about realism, because it's not what people expect it to be. It's something other than what we usually mean when we use the word realism. We use the word pretty specifically in art. Before I get started, I want to define a couple of terms: naturalism versus realism, because we have pretty specific meanings for those terms in the art world, and it isn't necessarily the same way the terms are used in other fields. In fact, I know from experience that in literature, they use the terms exactly the opposite. So I've had this discussion many times with friends in the English department when we've tried to teach together and we're using the same terms in exactly the opposite ways. So if you know literature, what they call realism is what we call naturalism, and vice versa. So it will be clarified. I hate it when it does this. It's still doing that flashing, whatever. So naturalism is really what we've been seeing in art through much of its history in the Western world. Not so much in the Middle Ages where they sort of distorted things, but most of history. Naturalism just means it's accurate. You know, if they're painting a tree, it looks like a tree. You know, it's the right colors, and you know, it's not purple, and it's basically a recognizable thing. That's called naturalism. It matches what you see in nature. But naturalism is always going to be mediated in some way. It's going to be either idealized, which is what we saw throughout, say, the Greco-Roman world, what we saw in the Renaissance, what we just saw the Academy favoring, and that is idealized art. Perfected, you know, it's accurate, but it's the perfect version of that thing. So that's not realism, that's an idealized naturalism. Or naturalism might be romanticized. Certainly that's what the Romantics did. It's glorified, or it's made exotic, or it's somehow more than what you see. Or it could be symbolic. It may be a natural tree, but it's actually referring to something entirely different. It's a symbol of something else entirely. That's one way to mediate naturalism. And then lastly, maybe it's just realistic. Now that's realism. Realism is one type of naturalism. Realism is where you actually tell the truth. You don't pretty it up. You don't exoticize it. You don't use it as a metaphor for something else. It's just what it is. And realism is the single most controversial art ever made. Because let's face it, nobody wants the truth. Everybody wants it perfected a little bit, prettied up a little bit. They want it from a particular point of view, something. They just don't want to see the bare truth. And it's extremely rare in art. It's rare anywhere in the world in art. It's very rare in the Western world. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah.
So if an artist painted all the zits and carbuncles and bald spots, then he wouldn't have a reduced clientele up to this point, right?
And we're going to look at, in just a minute, we're going to look at somebody that does exactly that. I'm going to talk about why he does it. Realism is very political, and we'll see why it raises its head. And every time it pops up, it's very political. And there's a reason why they're telling you those truths. It's got to be some reason. But yeah, you know, you get your photo taken, they retouch it, right? Nobody wants to really see all these portraits that have been painted throughout all of history. You know, they're not exactly what the person looked like. You know, it's a little better. Somebody's going to pay for it. You know, you want them to hire you again. So you show someone to their advantage. But yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's all the warts. It's all the bald spots. It's all the pudgy overweight. That's realism. Photoshop. We have Photoshop now. Heck with realism. We just don't need that. Yeah.
to be part of this
Well,
realism?
it's not part of realism. It's not. Realism is separate from symbolic. These are the four types of naturalism.
Okay, I don't see how it could be naturalism.
Well, let's use an example of like a bowl of fruit. Bowls of fruit are often used symbolically to symbolize abundance and well-being. So you could paint a very, very naturalistic, accurate looking bowl of fruit, but it's not, the painting isn't about fruit, right? It's about whatever that symbolizes. It's about abundance, and sometimes it's about fertility. Fruit will be used to symbolize fertility. That's what I mean by symbolic, that it's not about that thing. And we don't see that too much in the modern world. So let's talk about the controversy of realism, because it absolutely is that. One reason why realism was so controversial was that people argued, well, you're not doing anything, you're just mirroring the world, right? You're just, here's the thing and you just painted it, and that's not a style. I mean, they argued that realism wasn't a style, that it was like a style. These are the same criticisms, by the way, that were leveled against photography, and why photography struggled for so long to be recognized as an art form, because people said, you're not doing art, you're just pointing this mechanism and pushing a button. You're just duplicating or mirroring. That's not art. So that's one thing that was leveled against realism. But that's a misconception, because that's making assumptions. It's assuming that there can ever be a sort of pure, unconditioned way of looking at the world. And it's what we just talked about in relation to landscape. You never just mirror the world. You're always making artistic judgments when you do that. You're deciding number one, what to look at. I may paint the refrigerator, paint a picture of the refrigerator, but I made a decision to paint that refrigerator as opposed to paint that table. There's some decision being made, there's some artistic choice. So everything you see, we already know perception is conditioned on your beliefs and what matters to you and all of that. So, that argument is really a misconception. There's no such thing as pure observation. It's all perception. It's all what filtered through the human mind. Everything a human being does is filtered through the human mind, and it's immediately going to have interpretations and associations. Refrigerator may not mean to me the same thing it means to you. We have different histories, connections to things. So that's one sort of reason it was criticized. Another is a more obvious one, and that it's low and mundane, that it's very common. Now you got to remember what we've been looking at. The art of the academy was all about heroism and great political figures, and it was about big ideas, grand statements, right? Things that are really important, moral values. Even landscape was supposed to elevate the human soul. It was a place you went. It was something elevated about it. But there's nothing elevated about that image of a couple of peasants walking through the field. They begin depicting people and places that were considered low and mundane. And on the handout, actually, I have a quote from a couple of different critics. One critic who says that the realists depict classes too unworthy, sufferings too low, tragedies too foul-mouthed, catastrophes whose terror is not sufficiently noble. The character of the poor is unfit, as an unfit topic for art. I think about that. I mean, that was a common held belief in the 19th century. It's sort of an appalling statement to make today. So why were the poor considered unfit for art? Why do you think?
The poor in that context, in that time frame, were unfit. They were less than. There was lower class people. There was such a structure. They were low life.
They were low life, yeah. And they were that way for a reason. The important thing is they believed that your position and status in society was based on your value, your moral value. And if you were poor, it's because you were meant to be poor, because you were morally unfit. That was the definition of poor. That's why they had no inclination to help the poor or elevate the poor. You're there because God wants you to be there, because you're an unfit person. So there was a moral distinction made on your position and status in society. Yeah.
So this is all happening against the background of the anti-slavery movement starting in Britain, the industrialization and the
Yes.
American Revolution, the French Revolution, and so all
It's-
these quote unquote poor become noble revolutionary type.
It's happening,
Elements.
absolutely. It's after the revolutions. Those were 18th century. We're now into the 19th. It's with the background of industrialism, it's the background of the rise of capitalism. Capitalism is changing everything because, as we're going to see, capitalism was an intensely abusive system. You know, my students today don't know a darn thing about capitalism. They see it as an economic system with all these controls and things that keep everything in check. There was none of that in the 19th century. It was rampant capitalism, every man for himself, selfishness. And it was abusive, and people worked in dangerous conditions for long hours, and nobody gave a damn because you made more money that way. That was capitalism. And so it's not surprising that it immediately gave rise to an oppositional voice, and that was socialism. And we're going to talk about socialism because people are writing about this in the 30s and the 40s. The Communist Manifestos published in 1848. All these ideas are in the air, and they come out of the Enlightenment, you know, which was questioning how we should live and what should, you know, how should we behave. There's a complex layering of changing ideas that define the modern world. And this is sort of part of it. And you see those changes happening right now. So we're going to come back and talk about socialism and how that relates to realism, because it absolutely does. The early realists were socialists, and they're absolutely acting on their beliefs in depicting this class. So people are beginning to challenge that. In fact, the second quote I have here from another critic says, "It is good to descend, or if you will, rise once more to the classes that scarcely ever had the privilege of being studied and put into the light by painting. The portrait of the worker in his smock is certainly worth as much as the portrait of a prince in his golden robes." So there are different points of view here. And quite often how you felt about realism was based on your politics. You know, what did you believe politically? You know, were you a conservative? Did you believe the old system of moral value, or were you more contemporary? Were you more Republican? I hate doing this, but Republican was a good word in the 19th century. It meant you supported a republic as opposed to a monarchy or an empire. Yeah.
Now, last time we covered a lot of artists who were born into families that had money, so they had leisure time to learn art. Now, are the realists coming from the poor
Same place.
class, or are
Same
they
place.
still
They're- yeah.
wealthy?
They're still from enough wealth that they can afford to do this. They're still going to be middle class.
Okay.
They're still going to be middle class. Yeah.
I keep thinking of the caste system. Like,
The caste system.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because you kind of have to keep people in the working to work, to take
Right.
care of everyone else.
Yeah.
Some of this, I think, goes prior to the Industrial Revolution, is the hierarchy in Europe of you either own land or you didn't.
Right.
And the peasants or the serfs
Right.
were the poor. They became the poor.
Right. That when you move to an urbanized world, the people who were the serfs and the peasants now just are the working class. They're the people in the factories and in the mines, but there's always a big underclass. And we don't call it a caste system because it isn't as rigid
Yeah.
as the caste system in India, for example, but you know, it's not It's the same thing. It's a system where it's very, very hard to change your position to get out of that. But what industrialism is doing in its giving birth to the middle class is opening those doors. There are a lot of people who've moved into the middle class now that were working class, and the middle class we know is empowered a lot more. They're having a lot to do with art. This attention on the world they live in gives rise to an interest in being very contemporary in art, being about now. You know, when you think about the classical art of the Academy, you know, they're depicting ancient Rome and they're depicting Greek myths. There was a real call among the realists to depict what's going on right now. You know, stop looking off to the past. There's plenty of stuff right now you should be looking at and talking about. And that leads to not only what we call contemporaneity or being about now, but even instantaneity, which is the idea of trying to depict reality as a single instant of reality. And I'll come back to that idea because that's going to be very important when you get to people like the Impressionists who are trying to capture like a moment of light and the like. We'll talk about that, but that's very much part of it. Subject matter and moral fitness, we sort of talked about that, and read those quotes. And then the politics of speaking the truth. To the realist, idealism is a lie. Romanticism is a lie. When you look elsewhere, you're doing something that is morally wrong. Realism really, for many artists, took on a moral stance. It's a moral obligation to tell the truth about the world you live in. Enough people are ignoring what's going on. You have an obligation.
Number 4, are those real words that
Yeah,
use
they
in the
are.
art world?
Yeah, contemporaneity. It's a noun referring to something that is contemporary.
Okay, I
So-
haven't seen it before.
I know you don't see them used much. It's sort of a specialized term that we use because we're talking about it a lot, but it's a real word. You're not going to see it much. Contemporaneity and instantaneity are things. They're nouns, version of words we usually don't use as nouns.
So artists actually use those words?
Art historians do. I don't think artists do. Social critics and art historians do. So let's talk about this idea of politics.
Before we do
Yeah.
that, we got other specific-
Yeah,
Is that a quite black and white, or is it? I
it's,
mean,
it's a drawing. We're actually going to come back and look at that later, but it's a drawing by a French artist.
I think it's very romantic and spiritual, myself.
Beautiful, because you're absolutely right. When we come to him, we're going to see his work. It's realist in the sense of who he's depicting, but you're right. He will give it a very romantic edge. That's a really good observation. Very, very good.
I really like it.
I do too. I love his work, but yeah, we'll look at this in some of his other paintings. But he's someone who has less problems because he does romanticize a bit, and so he's less objectionable than other artists. Okay, so let's talk about where do we first see realism? In the Western world, the first place we see realism is in, can I ask everybody to mute? Are we all muted? Unmute, unmute. Everybody's muted. Okay. Anyway, it's the Romans. You know, all the ancient world is all what we call stylized or distorted. If you look at it, you can see it's not 100% accurate. But the Romans, beginning in the Roman Republic, begin to make true realism for the first time in Western art. And you can't miss it. You know, when you look at a Roman portrait bust, we have some beautiful ones in the Nelson Gallery, some beautiful Roman portraits. But these are very obviously what someone looks like. There's no doubt whatsoever when you look at this that you're seeing a guy looks like that. Everybody out there in Zoom land, would you double check to see if you're muted? Because we're getting some weird noises here. Thank you. So the Romans start doing this. So the question is, why would they do this? Because they seem to emphasize age, old age. They emphasize peculiarities and like warts and all sort of thing. And it's totally political in the Roman Empire. Rome was based on power and particularly your relationship to men of power. And so they started commissioning this new kind of art form called a bust, which is just literally from the bust up. It's just focuses on the head. The Greeks never made anything like this. If the Greeks made a figure, it was the whole figure. The Romans started the portrait bust, just focusing on the face, because it was all about your political connections, who you were related to. I love this figure on the left, which is a standing figure who wants to be shown holding two portrait busts because he wants you to know who he's connected to. This is about power and position. And it was essential that you see and recognize all these people. The emphasis on age was also about power. It's sometimes hard in our world because we're so youth oriented, but Rome wasn't like that. It was very much about age. Your power was based on your age, your service to the state. So showing your age was an important thing. That meant you were a highly respected person and a highly powerful person. So, it's not an artistic or aesthetic reason why they do this. It's purely political. And realism will have that. After Rome, realism disappears again, and it rarely appears. There are a few times a couple artists get a little too close to realism in the 17th century, and they get in a lot of trouble for it, and it just sort of ends. It's not until now, the mid 19th century, where once again, we begin to see realism. Now, other things feed into it that we're beginning, things like the Dutch genre scenes. If you were with us last year when we did the overview of Western art, when we looked at the Dutch Netherlands, we talked about this new kind of painting called a genre scene, which was new in art. And that's their interest in these sort of little quiet moments of ordinary things happening. A genre scene is basically just means ordinary people doing ordinary things. That was revolutionary in art in the 17th century. Nobody depicted ordinary people doing ordinary things. Art was about important people and important things. So genre scenes begin in the 17th century, and they continue to be popular, although they're not really the same as realism at all. But nonetheless, they're going to feed into this taste. In the 18th century, Enlightenment moralizing also feeds into this idea. And this is a scene from Hogarth from a series called The Marriage a la Mode, or The Stylist Marriage. And, it's telling a story. It's about this guy who's wasted all of the family money, and his wife is running around, and their business person's throwing his hands up. It's moralizing, but it's also looking, into someone's world or someone's private world.
Honestly, the previous one and this one, I appreciate how long it would take to paint that thing. The detail in that.
Yeah. This one's small, well, both of them are actually fairly small. Those are not big paintings. They're like smaller paintings, which makes it more reasonable. So both of them are fairly small. That's the way you make it happen. Doesn't take nearly as long, but still.
As you study it, the more you see the more
detail.
you see, like the decorations on the mantle,
and they all mean something. They all signify someone who's like spending vast amounts of money, like wasting money. Your family fortune is gone because you bought all these millions of little French things. It's an English painting. So they're actually referring to all of these French things that he's bought. Yeah, you got it. That's okay. Doesn't bother me. Gives me a chance to take a break. So I want to talk about an artist named Daumier, Honoré Daumier, who's really a very important artist. We didn't look at him last year when we did the overview, but now I want to really look at what he does, because he's very important, and he really sort of figures into this development of realism. In the 1830s in particular, this idea of observing the world and observing people in your world starts to become really important. They were called physiologies, and there were a lot of little pamphlets written about it. People were writing about sort of social characteristics of different types of people, and they were often given a kind of medical basis. It's a kind of satiric wit. Daumier is generally known as sort of a cartoonist, a sort of political cartoonist, because a lot of his images are really made for reproduction in magazines and pamphlets and the like, as that is really prominent in the 1830s and 40s. There's this proliferation of media, small media, print media, and that's because in the 1820s, they had just invented a new printmaking technique called lithography. And once lithographs were around, they could start doing quicker and easier kind of visual reproductions. And that's when magazines start having all these images in them, and a lot of new magazines arise at that time. And Daumier here is playing with this idea of these physiologies. They also used to believe that you could read character in someone's physical appearance, like this is where things like he looks shifty, his eyes are too close. I mean, that idea goes back to the 19th century, the idea that where your eyes are placed could identify criminal intent. Or they would read phrenology, like they'd read the bumps on your head, and that could. So they believe that some sort of physical characteristic was really a representation of your character or some internal character or quality, and they were kind of obsessed with that idea in the early half of the century. So they had, sort of stereotypical images of people like the grocer, the nun, the lawyer. These were all, it's the same way we think of like, well, the soccer mom looks like this, and we have social, stereotypes that we make too. It's the same sort of thing. So that's what these are. And he's doing them sort of satirically, the Parisians appreciating a paved road, they don't know how to, they're all funny. They're all meant to be very witty, or the guy with the big nose who's seeing the sun for the first time. Now, one of the things that very much affects Daumier and art in general is the revolution of 1830. And I mentioned it before. It helped the landscape painters a little bit. This is when the middle class become empowered. This is Louis Philippe. He's the guy that managed to take power by placating the middle class. He understood they were powerful, and if he had them behind him, he would become powerful. Well, Daumier and many artists from the beginning were very negative toward Louis Philippe. He actually started out by being liberal, and he eliminated press censorship. That only lasted about a year because, people came down on him. It's very hard for totalitarians to let go of press censorship, because the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to be criticized. And a totalitarian who is used to being in power and never being criticized really is a hard time taking criticism for the first time. I've seen it in countries where there have been changes, and there's almost been another revolution. I think it sounds good to be liberal and free, but they don't want to be the ones getting all the criticism. Well, within a year or so, he shuts down. But Daumier attacked him relentlessly. He understood him for what he was, a politician who just wanted to be rule as king, but he wanted the support of the middle class. So one of the first political cartoons he made was Les Pois. Pois means pear in French. And so you could see the sort of caricature of him step by step turns into this pear. But pois in French is also slang, and it also means fathead. it's an insult. So he doesn't have to say that. He just draws him as a pair, and every French person knows what he's saying. So, this didn't sit very well at all. And it was really tough on Louis Philippe because he was trying to pretend like he was this great liberal. And it was really hard for him to do that when he wanted to crack down so much. And so he got away with this one, but he didn't get away with this one. This is called Gargantua, and this is the one that got him 6 months in jail. He's depicting Louis Philippe here. Obviously, all he has to do is the pair head and everybody knows who it is. He's showing him devouring money and excreting decorations and honors, which is what the prior kings were criticized for as well, but he's showing it quite openly. He's taking advantage of this brief period of freedom of the press, but it's right after this. He goes to jail and okay, that's enough freedom. Censorship is back.
Now, what we're looking at here is, what is a lithograph?
A lithograph is a kind of print. So this is not like a finished work of art. This would have been printed in a magazine.
So
This is just a picture
that
from.
on a metal plate? Or how
It's a
do they-
lithograph. It's a little different. It's a stone. Lithography is made using a stone, and you draw on it using a kind of oily crayon, or sometimes with a brush with an ink, but it's an oil-based ink. And then you put water over the surface, and it's based on the principle that water and oil don't mix, that oil will repel the water. And so wherever you put the ink will pool in those areas, and then you lay a piece of paper on it and run it through a press, and it's a print, just like an etching or an engraving.
You could make a whole bunch of
Yes.
magazines off this particular thing?
Exactly. So you could print multiple copies. In fact, when both of these came out, Louis Philippe sent people out to buy up, all of the journals, all of the magazines that had it in it that he could find, to sort of confiscate it. But that new printmaking technique made it really gave birth to the cartoon, the political
So
cartoon.
that's why we're looking at a lot lithographs that lend themselves to black and white.
Yes, they're just ink on white paper. They're going to be black and white, ink on white paper. And there was a technique where you could print many of them while you're printing a magazine. They're not going to figure out how to do color till the end of the century, but they will eventually figure that out. But it does change journalism. It changes so much once you're able to do this technique.
So you have a whole bunch of people who can look at art now instead of going to a museum and looking at it.
Well, they were, they're really not reproducing art with lithographs. This is a political cartoon he just made to be published. He didn't make this as a work of art. He just made a political cartoon to print. Never, there's no original of this. It's just a political cartoon. In terms of reproducing works of art, they've been doing that for centuries, using etching, usually using engravings, but they've been copying works of art in black and white engravings since the 15th, 16th century. So there have been reproductions. They haven't been, they're like an individual reproduction, not like thousands of them, but just, a few, but not like a whole book of reproductions. He got a little scared after the 6 months in jail, so he kind of left Louis Philippe alone, but he still criticized his community, his world, and looked at the sort of corrupt institutions. And he looks at all the institutions because they were all sort of corrupt. He certainly is not easy on the legal profession. Does hundreds of these cartoons of lawyers, the three chatting lawyers. The French system was a tribunal system where there were always three judges. That's why you see these groups of three together. But I love the one on the right, just titled Justice. Very telling. He did turn his hand to more serious things. You know, as Louis Philippe became less popular, there were constant uprisings. I'm telling you, most of the 19th century, France was in almost constant turmoil, and there were many uprisings. In fact, in 34, there were uprisings. There had been I don't remember the details, but someone shot at police from an apartment building, and they raided that building and killed everybody in it. They just ran through the building and killed everyone. They had no idea where the shot came from. They just wiped out this building. It was on Rue Transnonain, which is the street, and it was a huge scandal, as you can imagine. And Daumier did this image of the massacre. He hadn't really seen it. I mean, this wasn't based on anything. He just knew the story, and so he made this image of a family, like 3 generations here being wiped out, and it was published in one of these liberal magazines. It was, technically it wasn't illegal, because he wasn't openly criticizing the king per se, but it was a very powerful image, and everyone knew what was going on, and it helped this sort of antagonism against him. After this, Louis Philippe really totally begins to crack down on dissidents. And that's going to, of course, lead to his downfall, because it always does. This is also the 30s, is this real period of socialist writing, a lot of socialist theorists, a lot of French socialists and a lot of French socialist writers. So you're getting all these things happening at once, rioting in the streets, this abusiveness, particularly under Louis Philippe. The working class had it rough because he was placating the middle class. And so they didn't care whether the working class were downtrodden or not. And things were getting worse and worse. And it does lead to revolution. And I talked about this briefly before, but it's the realists who really are affected by this revolutionary change. It happened in 48, the February Revolution. And remember, this was a true socialist revolution. This was the working class wanted to set up a socialist government in Paris. It failed. They didn't have the support to do that, but they did throw Louis Philippe out of power, and they negotiated a compromise and set up a republic. This is when France, for 4 years, has a republic. They have their first election. They elect their first president. They elect Louis Napoleon as president with the support of the working class. Remember, this is a working class revolution. The middle class wasn't happy about this. They were doing fine under the king. They didn't really need this. So we get the Second Republic, and for 4 years, there is this flowering of liberalism. This was hugely important to the realists, who were totally on the outs before this. You have the so-called free salon in 1848. That means no jury, everybody shows. Realists walked in the door. They could never have gotten in that door before. But in 48, they walked in the door. And then for 3 years after that, they weren't free, but they were liberal salons. They had an elected jury. The artists elected the jurors. It wasn't a bunch of old men from the academy. And so it was still pretty open. Also, working class got the vote. Whoa, working class men got the vote. Working class men got the vote for 4 years. So end of 4 years, Louis Napoleon's up for re-election. I don't think he ever intended to stand for re-election. He does what his great uncle did, declares an empire. At the end of 51, begins in January of 52, begins the Second Empire. And the Second Empire is a long period that's good for some artists, bad for others. But the reality is those 4 years, you can't take back. And once people walked in that door, they weren't going to walk out again. And everything changes because of those 3 years. They try to close the doors. They do close some doors. They take away the vote of the working class. Louis Napoleon says, you had 4 years to vote. You got me in office. I don't need you anymore. It's basically what he said. Now, again, Daumier is not a supporter of Louis Philippe. Even during the brief republic, he knows the guy. He knows who he is. He knows this is not a good thing that's just happened. This is another political cartoon. What it says below it, it says the urchin of Paris in the Tuileries Palace sinks in the armchair. That's Louis Philippe. That's a reference to Louis Philippe. He's calling him the urchin of the palace. Louis Philippe was a kind of street fighter. He was very different from, I keep saying Louis Philippe, I mean Louis Napoleon, I'm sorry. Louis Napoleon, the emperor, was very different from the king, the previous king. Louis Napoleon was a kind of bully, and he had all these people going around supporting him that were like pushing people around and beating him up and telling them vote for him. When I talk about a free election, I don't really mean this was a free election. He bullied people into electing him because he knew he was then going to make himself emperor. And so he's sort of depicting him here as a street urchin who was a kind of the urchin he's referencing to had a reputation. They were young street thugs is basically what he's depicting him as here, and his supporters around him. Realism, I love this statement. Realism was conceived in the July monarchy. Under Louis Philippe, you had all these socialists writing, people were thinking about it. It was born in the Second Republic when the doors were open and it walked through, and then it matured in the Second Empire, Napoleon III. So this is sort of the root of realism. You know, Daumier made some sculpture as well, and his early opposition to Louis Napoleon was clear. Now this is 1851, which is during that republic, but you know, people in the know weren't fooled by it. This is ratappois, and ratappois means rat skin, literally, and it's a term that was used to reference these sort of thugs. They dressed in a certain way, they had a certain swagger. It's highly recognizable in this little sculptural piece, and they were the bully boys. They were a lot like Mussolini's black shirts, you know, who went through the streets and pushed people around. They were the bully boys out on the street that maintained the power. And Louis Napoleon had his ratappois, and he's depicting him here. So this is very political, which is why he never cast it in bronze while he was alive. He made it in plaster. And then that plaster was sort of put away because it was sort of dangerous, you know, certainly after 52, when the empire began, it's dangerous to criticize the emperor. So he never had this cast. This wasn't actually cast until after his death. I think in about 1899, they cast several of them. And this is one of the issues with bronze sculpture. Most sculptors simply make a plaster figure. They'll make it out of clay and then they'll cast it in plaster. And then it may or may not ever be cast in bronze, because they used to actually display the plaster cast. There would be exhibitions of works like this, the plaster. Now, sometimes they would be cast in bronze during the artist's lifetime. Sometimes it wouldn't be till years later. It's why we have so many versions of Rodin's The Thinker. You know, they're in every museum. You know, Rodin didn't make 20 of these. Rodin made an original. Everybody afterwards made the cast. And it is a complex issue for historians. So, you know, what is the real piece? Does the artist have to have seen it for it to be genuine? And it was a huge, back in the 80s, it was a huge controversy here in Kansas City. I don't know how many of you remember the controversy in the 80s about the Remington sculptures. And there's some sculptures here on the plaza that people are still pissed about because they've been distorted. That's the problem. Most of those sculptures on the plaza are not the original size at all. The originals that Remington made are like about this big. And later people duplicated those, made them bigger and cast them in bronze, and they're calling them Remingtons. Are they? No, that's an issue. So when you're dealing with sculpture, it gets complicated. That's just a little thing I wanted to throw in. Because of the politics, he turned away from overt political and did more fine art, but he never gets away from political at some level. This is a very important work, an important subject in 1850 called The Heavy Burden. The subject, first of all, it is a working class woman, something that only the realists are depicting at this point in time. The subject of a washerwoman is not new in art. They have been depicted before in the 18th century and on, but they were almost always depicted as somewhat disreputable or loose. The whole theme of working women we're going to be talking about, because that alone is controversial and political. More and more women in the 19th century enter the workforce, and in a way they never had before. And that's a product of urbanization, right? Once you're urbanized, the working poor, even if you have a family, don't make enough to live on. Yeah.
Okay, now this one is in color, right?
This is a painting. This is an oil painting, just like any other oil painting. This is not a political cartoon. It was never reproduced. He's now doing fine art, and he's actually exhibiting fine art. So he also does fine art, and he turns more to that in these later years when politics is dangerous and magazines are being shut down and people are going to jail for political cartoons. He turns to fine art. So yes, good point. This is a small oil painting. And he's not depicting her as a sort of loose woman. Typically, any woman working was tantamount to being a prostitute. I mean, the idea is if you're going to have a job, you're selling yourself. I mean, and they're not 100% wrong. Many women did have to turn to prostitution. It was a huge scandal because you couldn't eat, you didn't have enough money. And we'll talk more about that because it does become a huge scandal by the 1880s. But he's depicting her not in she's not sexualizing her, which is what they typically did, working class women. And The Heavy Burden is a really interesting title. Notice we're having now titles. 19th century is when artists began titling works of art and really putting like a meaningful title where a phrase or statement adds to the work of art, becomes a part of that work of art. It's not just a descriptive inventory label anymore, which is what it was 100 years earlier. It was just something describing it. Now it has a meaning, and this is a good example of that. The Heavy Burden adds a whole other level of meaning. It implies the hardship she's going through. Is he referring to the things she's carrying or just her life in general? I mean, the implication possibly is she is an unwed mother. She's taking her child with her as she's working. That implies something as well. So it is a political statement. This is a powerfully political image, but it's in the guise of an oil painting. It isn't really bothering people that much. It also doesn't bother people because it's small, and that matters, as we'll see in a moment. Size matters. And then some of his most famous series, and the one that I adore and most people love, he does this whole series of paintings on Don Quixote. And to me, this is so Daumier. I know he identifies with Don Quixote in so many ways. Don Quixote is this Spanish knight. He's obsessed with books of chivalry. And in his mind, he escapes to this heroic world that's long dead. And he's just this guy who's out of touch with the world he lives in. And everybody just thinks he's crazy, but he goes around as if he's a knight on horseback. And it's this ultimate sort of symbol of like, they call it tilting against windmills in our society. Means, you're working, you can't win, you're just fighting this horrible thing. But it's like a good person that's trying to do good, and he just can't get it done. And I think he totally identifies with Don Quixote. That's why we get this series. And they're really interesting paintings stylistically. They're very unusual for the 60s. I mean, they're very loosely handled. They're very small. I don't have the dimensions, but he never does anything large. They're quite small. So, he's the sort of madman that's trying to change the world and can't accomplish anything. So this is Daumier. He's really laying the foundation. And I want to say something briefly about Charles Baudelaire, and we're going to encounter Charles Baudelaire next time more. He's an extremely important person in the 19th century, a poet, art critic. He's best known in literature as a poet, but he was an important art critic and an important describer of Parisian culture. He's an observer, and he talks in his reviews about Parisian culture. He's analyzing it. Beginning in 1845 is when he begins writing criticism. And he was in the 40s, he's a defender of the Romantics. You know, he's very much a defender of Romanticism. And in his first what we call salon. Okay, the salon refers to the exhibition, right? The big exhibition, but it's also what we call reviews of the exhibition. And Baudelaire wrote these very, very long discussions about art after each after each big salon each year. And the one from 1846 was a very important one. The last chapter was titled "On the Heroism of Modern Life." We could talk a long time just on that title. You know, the whole idea that there's something heroic about merely existing in the modern world, that just living a modern life, you've got to be some kind of a hero. It implies the complexity of living in the modern world. And so even while he's defending the Romantics, even this early, he's talking about the city. One of the things he says is the life of our city is rich in poetic and marvelous subjects. He called it modern beauty. Now, this is one of the earliest people to sort of recognize that idea that this modern city is creating a modern environment, and that artists should turn to that. Now, this is just an early reference. We're going to come back to him. His most important writings in the 1860s, and this is where, you know, realism is really going to peak, and he's going to really completely turn to support realism and sort of forget about, really attack the Romantics on various grounds later. But I did want to introduce Baudelaire, because he's a voice out there that we're going to hear more about later. The real founder, the beginner, the creator of realism is one of the most interesting people you're going to encounter in 19th century art world. His name is Gustave Courbet, and I'm going to, oops, let's back that up. No, I've sort of, there we are. I'm going to take a second here and look at some of my Zoom people and see how you're doing before I move on and start a new artist. Does anybody have any questions or comments on anything we've talked about so far? No, okay. Okay, just wanted to be sure. Yeah, Kay.
There we go. This isn't important really, but I was struck that lithography is what you had, you described it, is still, of course, in use. And spending my life around printing presses, it's exactly what you do for offset printing.
Right.
It is basically the same procedure that they used then.
That's
that became the modern way to print before we had desktop printers.
Well, that's interesting, because I didn't realize it hadn't changed. I'm really not up on sort of contemporary techniques, but yeah, they began experimenting with it in the 1820s, and a lot of artists were experimenting with it. And then, boy, by the 30s, it just exploded, and you get a whole new kind of journalism and magazines, and it was really brilliant.
Well, offset printing is basically oil and water don't mix.
Oil and water. Yeah.
As long as you know that, you can print.
Right.
And it done the same way. It's the same principle.
Yeah, it's so much better than the old like engraving and etching where you had to do all this linear work. I mean, it was entirely different. Yeah, Mike?
Now, the last two guys that you popped up there are both, those are photographs, photography starting.
These two guys? Yes, photography, 1839. And you start seeing photographs by mid-century. Everybody's being photographed.
Does that start to affect realism?
Absolutely. That's another excellent point. Absolutely. Once you have photography, that's going to change everything. It's not going to change, it's going to change realism to some extent, but it's going to change things like portrait painting is going to practically disappear. I mean, who's going to go to a portrait painter when you can go to a photographer? I mean, so yeah, it's going to change a lot of things in art. But definitely how people look at the world. I'll point that out when we get to some paintings. We're going to look at some paintings, not today probably, but next week, where when you look at it, you can say, why does it look so odd? Why is somebody cut off here in the middle? And why is it this strange angle? And that's from photography. They're going to find seeing it's not always be more random. So yeah, photography will affect things.
Very important paintings done anywhere except in France.
France was the center of the Western art world, but yes, there is. And when we get to like Impressionism, for example, we're going to see that how that plays out in Germany and in America. Americans are mostly coming to Europe and studying in either Paris or Munich is another place. But it's happening in other places, but the innovations are happening in Paris. Everybody's just following them and catching up with them at this point. Now that's going to change. But in the 19th century, it's still largely Paris. 20th century, all hell's going to break loose, but that's another story. So let's go back and talk about our friend Courbet. He is largely self-taught, but he briefly went to, remember the Swiss Academy? It's one of those private little groups in Paris, very briefly, but he doesn't stay there for very long. Nonetheless, our internet is unstable. I'll have to tell them about that. There was a little notice that popped up about our internet being unstable. Not sure why that is. Anyway, by the late 40s, he was a follower of Charles Fourier. Now, I talked about all those socialist writers, socialist theorists in France. Fourier is one of them. And Fourierist socialism was one type of socialism prominent in Paris. And he was, in fact, a friend of Fourier. I'm not an expert on all these different types of socialism, but I know the Fourierists were all about like living in small communities. Socialism is complicated, and there are many different types, even as early as the 1830s. Later, you're going to get, by 48, you get Marxist, Leninist. You'll start getting, anarchism is going to get really big by later in the century. But Fourierism is a lot about communal living in small communities, and a lot of the those sort of like New Harmonists. Are you familiar with like the New Harmonists in America, which was a sort of Fourierist group of socialists that set up, like in New Harmony, Indiana, was an experimental community. A lot of that goes back to Charles Fourier. So yeah, this continues well into the 20th century, but he was sort of part of that circle. So socialism is a very important part of his work. He starts out when he's a young man. First of all, he's not from Paris, he's from Ornans, which is a small French village way over on the Swiss border. And that's important because he will go back there quite a bit to work. When he starts, he's, here he's young, 23, comes to Paris, and he's studying in the, copying things in the Louvre, which is basically what they did. He was still very romantic. He's young. He hasn't become a realist at all yet. And this is an early work. From everything I've read, Courbet was really, really good looking when he was young and very, very self-confident. And you can kind of see that in this picture. I love this painting. It's not in great shape anymore, but I love this painting because I'm a sucker for anything with a dog in it. Plus, I used to have a black spaniel that looked a lot like that. But you can see that the tilt of his head, the way he's looking down. This is an arrogant, good-looking young man, and that's how he continues to see himself for pretty much the rest of his life. It was accepted in the salon. I mean, and that says something, that a self-portrait like this is in the salon. He submitted from 1841 on. He was rejected in 41, 42, 43, and then he got this in 44, and then accepted for 3 years. And then, we're getting up to later periods, and then we're getting into the free salon. So he's a fairly successful artist. He's sort of in the right place at the right time. Now, interestingly, when that revolution is going to happen in 48, it's interesting to look at these sort of bookends. We've got the revolution of 1830, which is when Louis Philippe gains power with the help of the middle class. And then that ends with the revolution in 48, the working class revolution in 48. But it's interesting to look at how artistic language has changed between those two periods. The painting on the left is a very famous painting by Delacroix. It's an allegory of the revolution. So in 1830, it's a romantic voice, and its story is told through a romantic allegory. That figure is a personification of France or victory. It's called Victory Leading the People, is the name of it. She's carrying, the tricolor flag, and you have people from all of the different classes working together, which, is probably not true. Yeah.
Is the sexual imagery of the woman to make her working class? You're talking about the working class were often depicted in an earlier time as, kind of risque because prostitution was on.
I don't think I think the intent is more to link her to a classical goddess. I think the intention is to put her more in that elite classical stance, not sexualize her, because she's beyond that. She's not a person. She's an allegory. She's victory. And in the classical world, victory was symbolized by the Nike. Remember, the winged victory was a female figure in those flowing garbs. And I think it's meant to link her more to that traditional Greek victory figure. But she's wearing the hat of a contemporary woman. It's not really a hat, it's a scarf, and she's carrying then the flag. So I think that's the intent. The whole thing is allegory, but they wouldn't have read, at the time, they wouldn't have seen her as a half-naked working class woman. That would have been, this is an elevated romantic allegory. It's not realism. So they wouldn't have, see, that's the thing is, people learn how to read a painting, and the way someone in 1830 would have known how to read that is different from the way someone in 1848 would know how to read that. Because realism hasn't come around yet, so they wouldn't have learned to read it in a different way. They would have known it was an allegory. But when we look at this image on the right, and by an artist named Meissonier, this is realism. This is just a statement of fact. There's no moral virtue being communicated here. It's purely, okay, here's what happened. Bodies in the street. That's a realist sensibility without moral underpinning. He's not trying to communicate something to you. And so that changes. It's a very short period, 18 years, and suddenly there's people know how to look at something differently and read it. Now, after the free salons, or when the free salons were sort of announced, he decided to make a grand statement. And he set out looking for some sort of a subject or a theme. Now, the last time we talked about this idea was when Géricault, you may not remember this, but Géricault is the guy who painted, remember the raft of the Medusa, all those people on the raft? Well, he wanted to make a big statement. He set out and spent, months or a year trying to find just the right subject matter. Well, that's sort of where Courbet is. He's trying to find subject, but Géricault went for something important and grand and makes this heroic statement about the raft, where Courbet goes back to his hometown at Ornans, where he had a studio, and he paints this huge painting, 10 foot by 22 foot. This is grandiose, of a funeral, and it's titled A Burial at Ornans. This is without a doubt the single most controversial painting ever exhibited in the Salon in Paris. Never has anything caused more of an uproar than this. And we might want to know, well, why? There's nothing particularly in it that stands out. Well, let's talk about what we're actually seeing here. First of all, it's his grandfather's funeral. While he was there, his grandfather dies. So he does this huge painting with all these individual portraits of the people who live in the town. His father by that time was actually the mayor of the city. It wasn't a city, it was a village, mayor of the village. And so he does these citizens from life, and he tells us the actual story of what happened. Now, there have been paintings about funerals before, hundreds of paintings about funerals. The deposition of Christ, or Christ being laid in the grave, is one of the most famous. So why is this so incredibly scandalous? Well, one reason was its size. If he had painted this smaller, it wouldn't have had anywhere near the impact. Remember how size relates to the subject matter? Right? When you have a grand scale, it suggests you're saying something grand, something.
What about the size of this wall?
Yeah, 22, 10. Yeah, that's just about right. And people were appalled because it wasn't important. It wasn't grand. It was a mismatch in their minds between the subject matter. And so they're trying to read into it what he means. People are used to reading into art. They know how to read an allegory. So this must be an allegory. It's this big. So what is it an allegory of? And they start looking for it, and there's nothing there. There's nothing that suggests.
There's the crucifix.
Yeah, well, it's a funeral. He's holding a crozier. I mean, this is just the true ritual. It's an actual funeral ritual, and this guy is holding this crozier. I know, I've had other people see it that way too. It's hard to read that because it looks like it's up on the hill or it's disconnected, right? Yeah, it's hard to see. Yeah.
So would the people in his hometown recognize themselves?
Oh, absolutely.
In the painting? So that would be one audience, which would be a little considered insignificant audience. And then there's the salon people trying to figure out what's the meaning of this painting.
Yep.
And then they're scratching their heads and it's ticking them off.
And he did show this in his home, in his village, before he took it to Paris. And of course, they loved it. Yeah.
Well, I notice people are looking away, and so is the dog looking away.
Yeah.
And then I noticed up there in the upper left, on the hill, it kind of looks like ruins or something.
Looks like a little village. I think it's just a little village.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just something you put into the background. But it's just the facts of a funeral. This is what a funeral looks like in the village of Ornans. So the grand scale puts them off. There's one other thing in this that is the most controversial of all.
Where? The whole.
The hole in the ground. Now, people were used to seeing, when you see a funeral, there needs to be something redeeming about it, like angels in the sky or some sunset that suggests rebirth, something that communicates the moral meaning. What they talked about was he's showing a hole in the ground, that he's just suggesting death is nothing but a hole in the ground. There's no suggestion of an afterlife. I mean, just because there's a priest standing there, there wasn't any moral underpinning. So they read into one, and it was considered blasphemous and heresy.
Well, if this is his father's funeral, who's
No, his
the
grandfather's funeral
grandfather? Okay, which one of these characters is?
is Courbet.
Uh-huh.
He's not,
Oh, he's not.
he
there.
didn't put himself in it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't believe he's any of those people. But it's not what he put in it that bothered people, it's what he didn't put in it. He didn't put in something that would help them know how to think about it. They were used to pre-digested images that show you how you're supposed to feel, that interpreted an event through a moral lens, that interpreted it through usually a religious, but at least a moral lens that elevated what that was. He's removed all of that and he's just giving you the facts. And so since he didn't give them that, they're going to add their own. You know, if he's not going to give us angels, he must be an atheist. If he's just going to show a hole in the ground and not suggest resurrection or something, then he's being blasphemous. And so it was really attacked on that level. You know, there's also the fact that, well, these are not really what I would call working class. The idea of working and middle class are more urban concepts. They have to do with industrialism. In a rural village, you don't have a striking difference because you don't have factories and whatever. What you have are just provincial people, which to the Parisians are basically equivalent to working class. I mean, these are provincials. They're as bad as working class. So the fact that they're provincials, you know, these are not capitalists or wealthy people. So it was sort of lowly and common on those grounds. Another thing that critics called it was egalitarian. Now that's interesting to think about. What was happening in 1849 and 50 that would cause them to think of this as egalitarian? They're reading something political into this. They're seeing it as a statement about equality somehow because of the fact that he's taking these common people and elevating them to 22 foot wide. Because that's what he's doing, is he's sort of, it is a political statement. He's sort of saying these ordinary provincial people are important enough to be on a painting that's 22 feet wide. And that's a political statement. It absolutely is. And you can imagine the middle class in particular are going to feel threatened. They're going to feel threatened because remember what's happening in 49 and 50. At this very moment, working class has a vote. They were terrified by that fact. The middle class was absolutely terrified of the fact that working class people could vote. That's why, you know, that went quick. That didn't last. That's the last thing they wanted, was working class people to have the vote. They've had all the power through the whole July monarchy. And now you're giving some power to the working class? No way. Yeah.
Could it possibly be urban versus rural too?
There's a good bit of that. Yes, there's no question. I think that's without a doubt, Paris sees itself as its own country. I mean, that's going to come up again. They don't even see themselves as part of France. There's Paris, and then, you know, that's it. I kind of sometimes think New Yorkers think that way.
So this was painted in 1850.
Yeah,
okay?
49, 50.
So if you went up through history to the 60s, 70s, turn of the century, would the patrons of art then have different criticisms of it as civilization changed?
Absolutely. Even within 10 years, the things that were controversial in 1850 are not in 1860. You know, everything changes, and it's changing fast. And it within 10, 15 years is commonplace to depict the class. It loses a lot of its political edge because of what's happening politically. A lot of this political edge is because of what is happening at that moment politically. Once that moment passes, it won't have that edge anymore. Yeah.
Peggy, into the structure of this thing, how do you get a 10 by 22 foot something to paint on? Is this canvas?
Canvas.
And then what, and it's not woven that way. Is it sewed together? Is it done like
honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether he had one big single. He could have had individual pieces. It wouldn't show because he would gesso over it to get the smooth surface,
Sure.
and you wouldn't see if it was joined.
Yeah, but it seemed to me you would have to have pieces sewn together and then.
It makes
then
sense
just
that,
so- Yeah.
yeah,
have
you could
pieces.
disguise the surface. So he probably, yeah,
Yes,
had
those
multiple
matches.
pieces, but I've never really looked that much about it. So this painting was either horrible or wonderful, depending on your political beliefs, not your artistic beliefs, but your political beliefs. But it was absolutely provocative. And in many ways, what I find interesting is this painting, so this painting was exhibited, this is by Thomas Couture, a very successful and really important artist. This was in the Salon the year before the Revolution of 48. And then 2 years later, you get Courbet. And this, which showed it's called the Romans of the Decadence, is just as it's a little bigger even than Courbet's was. Now, this is actually more overtly political than Courbet's, and yet people had no problem with it because he's disguising that politics in this language of ancient Rome. What he's really depicting here are this sort of point. This Romans of the Decadence is a reference to this period in Roman history during the empire, when you have these extreme excesses of the nouveau riche. He's directly talking about the Parisian middle class here and their excess. They are the nouveau riche, the capitalists, the middle class, their excesses, which are going to lead to the fall of Rome. I think it's just ironic as hell that in 47, everybody says, oh, this is wonderful, and the middle class love this painting, and he's just ripping them to shreds in this painting. And he's basically pointing out a truth that within a year, they're going to fall out of power, just as the Romans did. And nobody got it. Nobody thought anything of this because of the way he told the story. And yet Courbet, who really has nothing political in here at all, is attacked by the class. It's just what people expected, what they were used to, and you could get away with anything. I mean, I love this painting because of what it is, you know, and because of what he's doing that nobody even noticed. It seems less political because of this language of ancient Rome. It works. People, see, the middle class weren't really that savvy in Paris.
Why did he paint that, Courbet?
Why did Courbet paint that?
Yeah. What was his reason?
Because he's a socialist and he was making a political statement. He was very intentionally making a political statement by putting these people, these provincials who were usually not depicted in art, but he's making a grand statement that these are important people. I'm going to put them 22 foot across. I'm going to put it in your face. He was overt. He knew what he was doing. He didn't care whether people got angry with him. He loved it. He was doing it for that purpose, really. He knew what he was doing and he knew how people would respond, and he just didn't care.
And that was his heritage.
That's what? Sorry?
That was his heritage, his family.
Yeah, and the village, yeah, but it was about his family. Yeah, I mean, it's also self-aggrandizing. Let's it's his grandfather. My family is important enough to be 22 foot across. I mean, there is that because that's him too. He really was like that. Now I wanted to just a bit about socialism, because remember, he is a socialist. And in the handout, I have an excerpt down there at the bottom from Proudhon. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, very important and really overlooked writer. You know, I'm a real fan of Proudhon's writing. In as early as in the 40s, you know, he wrote What is Poverty? What is Property? Not Poverty. He writes later about poverty. What is Property in 1840? And as I say here in the handout, he says property is theft. An insight that would later be attributed to Karl Marx. It always bothers me that Marx gets credit for that. I don't know why it bothers me. Karl Marx was not the first to say property is theft. It was Proudhon. his greatest work, The System of Economic Contradictions, or The Philosophy of Poverty, published in 46. He was imprisoned for his participation in that revolution of 1848 and later fled. But he wrote, I love this quote, to paint men in the sincerity of their natures and their habits, in their work, in the accomplishment of their civic and domestic functions, with their present day appearance, above all, without pose. Such would seem to me to be the true point of departure for modern art. To reproduce realities, once again, is nothing. One must think. Others before Courbet have attempted socialist painting and have not succeeded. The Stonebreakers is an irony addressed to our industrial civilization. And we're going to look at the Stonebreakers in just a second. The major theme of Proudhon's writing is that realism in art is a moral obligation. It's not a stylistic choice. It's like wearing your mask is a moral obligation. It's not an aesthetic personal choice. Truth-telling as the essence of modern art is an important idea, that he's now defining modernism as a new kind of morality. Remember, David thought something was modern when it showed these great moral virtues of heroism and self-sacrifice. Now, morality is being redefined, and Proudhon is saying, no, morality is when you tell the truth about the way things are, even when it's unpleasant and you don't want to hear it. So modernism is being framed, sort of definition of it. Now, this is the painting he was talking about. It's Courbet's most famous painting. And it was, of course, very notorious. And it was in the Salon of 1850 with the Stonebreakers. Truthfully, it wasn't as controversial as the Burial was. That was more maybe the size. This is 6 foot by 10 foot. It's not quite as big, but boy, this was controversial. I don't want to limit that. The Stonebreakers. Who are these guys? They're nobody. They're just the ordinary guys who actually do this work. In fact, he went out and hired 2 guys he found working doing this and brought them to his studio and used them as models to get the fabric right, the textures, the coarseness of their clothes, all of that. He's being very accurate. Now, this is realism in its fullest. Stonebreakers. This is also very much a reflection on sort of the changes that are happening in the city. The city's changing dramatically with industrialism. Roads are going in everywhere. That's what they're doing. They're breaking stone, make gravel, lay roads, build the new city. And so this is a backbreaking, unending job. This is never going to stop. It's like the hardest of the hard, the lowest of the low. And he's elevating that work. I mean, that is controversial. These are the people that the middle class who go to the salon to see the exhibition don't want to look at. These are the people, you know, when they're in their carriage riding to the exhibit, you know, they'll pull down the shade so they don't have to look at these people. So they get to the salon and what's hanging right in their face is this. Now, the politics of this cannot be overstated. This is intensely political. The minute they look at this, they go, oh my God, number one, that's ugly. I don't want to look at those people and their clothes and these coarse fabrics and everything. But also, oh my God, those people can vote, which was just as scary to them. So you can't remove the politics from a painting like that. You try and look at this and analyze it aesthetically, you know, you miss the whole point. This is pure politics. He's chosen, yeah, go ahead.
So he's painting in color, he's painting in a salon, and the hoi polloi are coming to look at it, okay? And it's in their face, and they're probably not going to spend the big bucks to buy that painting, versus the earlier ones you showed in black and white, the lithographs that would, would reach a different audience.
Right.
So, and this is all going in the background of the turmoil of the 1800s.
Yep.
So did the painting stay in the salon? Or?
Well, it was in that exhibition. This is the annual exhibition, so it was up. I mean, the annual exhibition lasts about 3 to 4 months. Remember, this is the free period. This is the period where
Right,
you can
right.
get in. So it was there and it hung there the whole time. People don't put them in the salon. Well, they put them in the salon for different reasons. Most artists wanted to show in the salon because it would get you commissions. It's
Right.
not because they wanted to sell that work. It was because they wanted people to see it, and then they would come to them and commission them. Courbet didn't do it for those reasons. Courbet did it for political reasons, totally. He didn't care if somebody came and commissioned him to do anything. In fact, we're going to talk more about that idea that artists don't care about commissions anymore. They're caring less and less about commissions. In fact, at a certain point, I mean, that whole system is going to really, it's disappearing. That whole patronage system is
So-
disappearing.
How
Can
do
you talk about the free salon a little bit?
I'm sorry, the what?
Free salon?
Pre-salon? I'm not sure what you mean.
Free.
Oh, free, sorry, I thought you said pre, sorry. The free salon is what happened in 1848, when there was a revolution and they overthrew the king and set up a republic and elected a new president, and he wanted to be popular. So he did away with that jury system that had been run by the academy. He did away with it. And so for the first year, anybody could show. And then for the next 3 years, it was not completely free and open to everybody to show, but it was very liberal and most people could get in. They elected a jury of peers, really, who were letting in everybody. So it's more or less 4 years where everybody got the chance to show their art. And Courbet just slipped right in there and got his work shown. And it worked. He's and yeah, you mentioned like all these things. That's what makes it so interesting, is like all these things are happening all at the same time. It's one of those moments where it all comes together. He's chosen 2 people, an older man and a younger boy, and he's done that to sort of make this connection to the idea that this is unending, backbreaking labor. Like that man probably has been doing this since he was a young boy, and that young boy is going to be doing this when he's an old man. You know, it sort of reemphasizes that on the continuous multi-generational hard work. And he's also not showing us their faces. He's doing that intentionally because he doesn't want you to identify with them. He doesn't want to romanticize it. It's really easy to romanticize a subject like this. It's really hard to remove that romantic quality. All you need is a pretty sunset in the background and it becomes a romantic scene. And he doesn't want to do that. So hiding the faces, it's an oil painting, so there's color, but there's not a lot of color. It's kind of almost monochromatic of these earthy browns. And, he's doing that on purpose. He could give you some pretty colors in there, but that would take you away from the message he wants you to have. He doesn't want to pretty it up. A beautiful sunset would make this a noble act. And if this were a noble act, then you could feel okay about what they're doing. I didn't look at it much in this class, but last year when we were looking at a longer period of time, we looked at a number of what were called happy peasant paintings. Do you remember those? From the 17th century, 18th century, where they'd show these sort of beautiful landscapes and you'd have peasants out there enjoying themselves. And it was a way of making the aristocrats feel secure and safe, or they don't have to worry about the peasants because they're just fine. They're having fun. Look at them. They have a good life. They're really enjoying their life. And it made people feel better. I don't have to worry about you because you're doing fine. And it would be real easy to put a beautiful sunset here. And then people visiting could say, look at that noble, this is a noble act and good people. He doesn't want you to do that. He wants you to know the truth. It's not a noble act. It's a backbreaking act that will kill them. So it's very hard to not romanticize. And we're going to see other realists, kind of romanticize a bit because it just sort of happens. It's, grinding poverty. These two works in particular in this exhibition, The Burial and The Stonebreakers, really, really pointed out this widening gap between, the haves and the have-nots. And it was getting wider and wider. And it's the socialists who are pointing that out, right? He's a socialist. His goal is to present to you the plight of the working class. 48 communist manifestos published. That's what this is all about. It's about not hiding the working class anymore and telling you the truth about what's going on. So, 48, revolution of the working class. They were an untapped power base, which is why, Louis Napoleon recognized that and bullied them into voting for him. And thus we have the new Second Empire. So yeah, a very important piece. Now, Courbet, being who he is, he heard in 1853 that there was he was asked to submit works for an upcoming exposition. Now, we're going to talk at the end of this class in a few weeks about the universal expositions in Europe. In the latter half of the 19th century, there were a great number of expositions. Basically, they're like a world fair. We would call them world fairs, but they were in Paris. They were all over the US. This was a phenomenon of that century. We don't really have much in the 20th century, but there was going to be in 1855, what was called the Universal Exposition in Paris. This is where countries demonstrated, their design sense, their manufacturing. It was like different countries came internationally. And every time there would be one of those expositions in Paris, it would replace the salon for that year. In other words, the exposition would have a big building and an art display, and that would be the big exhibition for that year. And the salon wouldn't do a separate one. So he knew that in 53, they told him in 55, there's going to be this exposition and you need to submit your works to this jury. And of course, he just had several years without a jury, and it'd be damned if he was going to let anybody judge him ever again. He's one of the first to really take that stance. In fact, he said he would not have his work judged by any jury whatsoever, since only he was fit to judge his work. He would withdraw rather than make the slightest sacrifice of having someone else judge his art. This is Courbet entirely. In fact, he said, I'm going to set up my own rival exhibition and you can all basically go to hell, which is what he said. So for the next 2 years, he set out trying to raise the money to do what he just said he was going to do. It was going to cost a lot of money to create his own exhibition. Nobody had ever done that before. Now, David had shown one work privately. Other artists had shown a work here or there, but nobody ever attempted to mount a big personal, retrospective exhibition. And that's what he wanted to do. So he needed to get money. So he did this painting and he took it to his supporter, his patron, Alfred Bruyas, who was living down on the Riviera. And this painting was meant to be a kind of gift for fundraising. It's called The Meeting, or Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet. And this is Courbet, who depicts himself as a kind of vagabond artist. Is sort of how he sees himself, meeting his great patron who is doffing his hat to him, and he has his own servant here. And it was a gift, and it was meant to sort of get money out of him. and raise funds. One reviewer who saw this painting said, it's got the wrong name. He said he should have named it Fortune Bowing to Genius, because that's how Courbet certainly saw it. So it's just this horrible attempt to get money from his supporter, but it didn't work. Bruyas didn't have the money. And so Courbet resigned himself to having to sort of go back and submit works. And out of that, we get one of the most bizarre paintings of the century, certainly one of his most bizarre paintings. And that is the Painter's Atelier, a real allegory of 7 years of my artistic life. There has been a great deal written about this painting as people try and figure out what he's trying to say here, because it's very confusing. First of all, of course, it's grand. It's Courbet, 12 foot by 20 foot, with himself in the middle as the center of attention. People said this was megalomaniacal, it kind of is to a great extent. The 7 years he references are the 7-year reign of Napoleon III. I mean, he's referencing the emperor here indirectly. And he said, it includes all the people who serve my cause, sustain me in my ideas, and support my actions, the whole world coming to me to be painted. So he was really kind of an egomaniac, but the people are sort of accessories to him. On the left side down here, we've got like a feathered, a plumed hat and a guitar and a dagger. These are like the cast-offs of romanticism, he tells us. That's the old romantic way. And these are sort of the people. There's sort of references to places he's been. People see some references to the time he spent in London. These are sort of unknown, sort of commoners. On the other side, we have his real supporters arranged more clearly and real portraits. Courbet's backers, Bruyas is in there, Proudhon is somewhere in there. I'm not sure who's who. This is Baudelaire over here, who was a supporter. So these are all of his supporters. And then himself in the center with this allegory of probably meant to be like a muse here, and his adoring child as he paints this landscape. And he actually did paint landscapes as well. He's not only doing political work, he does other things, but it's the Loire Valley where he's from, his hometown. And so again, it's about him. But first of all, so he's ready to submit works to that exhibition. He submits 14 works, which is a grossly inappropriate number. I mean, nobody submits 14 works. And he learned in the spring of 1855 that 3 of those 14 paintings were rejected. Now, what that means is he had 11 paintings accepted, and that is incredibly good. But he was upset because 3 were rejected, and he gets all huffy again and starts to renew his plans for an independent exhibition so he can show whatever he wants to show. And he manages to pull it together. And he has this pavilion set up. It was called the Le Realisme, or the Pavilion of Realism, where he showed something like 40 works of art of his. It was a retrospective. He gave his own retrospective. Nobody gives their own retrospective. I mean, that's just, ego to the limit. But he gave himself a retrospective. But the other thing that is often misstated, he still showed 11 works at the main exposition. He didn't pull those out. So he's showing 11 works in the exhibition that he's boycotting, while holding his own dissident exposition just right down the street. Now, this as an act of protest, this is a very important precedent. There have been alternate exhibitions before, right, where artists showed their own work somewhere and David charged entrance for people to see his paintings, but none of them were dissident. None of them were protests. This is the first protest, the first dissident exhibition. It's not going to be the last. It's an important precedent. Artists are going to pick up on that. Wasn't that successful? Not that many people went and saw it, but it was very important as a precedent for his works. And then he wrote a manifesto. He wrote 2 different manifestos, one in 55, where he said, to be in a position to translate the customs, the ideas, the appearance of my epoch, according to my own estimation, to be not only a painter, but a man as well. In short, to create living art. This is my goal. I'm not sure what he means by that any more than I'm sure what he meant by that painting of his studio. Yeah.
So you're talking, they're still in a big period of turmoil, and all the artists are trying, some of them are trying both the old method of getting a commission and putting food on the table, and some of these new techniques based on their political thing, and trying to figure out an alternate way of surviving.
Most artists in the 50s, not counting Courbet, most artists are still trying to work through the salon. They're trying to get into the exhibition. There aren't a lot of commissions now for anybody. Even salon artists are not getting commissions. When the patronage system collapsed, when this whole huge class of aristocrats largely disappeared after the revolution or shrunk down, that changed the patronage system. And what began and is slowly growing is the system in which artists have to make art first and then figure out how to sell it. Now, what that means is they have to begin thinking differently. They have to start thinking about, well, what would somebody want? Landscape is one of the first new types of subjects that worked well in this system. You could go out and paint a dozen landscapes. People wanted them. People were going to buy them. To accompany that system is a whole new system of what we would today call art dealers. How do you get them to people? If people aren't going to come to you and you're going to make art, then how do you get your art to people? And so what developed is they call them picture dealer shops or picture seller shops. And they were just shops and stores where you took your art and then people would buy it from there. So that system goes along with the change of patronage. But the idea of figuring out what to make that people might want, we have to understand also now more and more art buyers are coming from the middle class. So what is the middle class going to want? And as we're going to be seeing by the 1860s and 70s, that's going to be a new role that the academy takes on. By certainly 60s and 70s, more and more artists are removing themselves from the academy. They're finding their own exhibitions to show their art and sell it, and they don't have a need for that salon anymore. And so the quality of artists in the salon is going down, and the salon is taking on that role of filling a market for the middle class. We'll talk more about that next time, actually.
But wouldn't many of these people be financially solvent on their own?
Many are, but many aren't. I mean, they're solvent enough to get educated and set themselves up, but they still need to make a living. I mean, their families aren't rich. They're very few. There are some that are wealthy enough that they don't care, but most care, and they have families and they need to support themselves. And these picture dealers are doing a great job. But yeah, the whole system is slow. It's a slow process. There are always still going to be big commissions, just not as many. The government's going to make commissions for, big government buildings. They might want a big mural about, it's there. The church is still going to be commissioning some large works because it's still a Catholic country and the Catholic churches are still, filling churches. But there's also the middle class, and they want different things. And it's going to affect not only what is painted, but how it's painted. Paintings are going to get smaller. Middle class don't want 20 foot. Nobody's going to buy a 22 foot painting. I don't care what it is. Yeah, it's going to be smaller, and it's going to be not controversial at all. And it's going to, we'll see what it's called salon art. And next time I'll show you salon art and what the avant-garde are doing at the same time. But it's all just sort of beginning right here. I just wanted to show you one of these. He later turns to a lot of landscape because of the fact that he was getting into political trouble. He's not in political trouble yet. In 1870, he gets in a lot of political trouble, but his landscapes are interesting to look at. This is a really, I love his landscape, and it's not the same as like the Barbizon painters. When we looked at the French Barbizon landscape painters who are still working in 1865, their work was painted slowly and it was built up and the surface is encrusted. Courbet is working quickly, he's working rapidly. These are quick brushwork. I mean, you can see it in places like this. This is one quick little mark. It's closer to what we're going to be seeing the Impressionists doing within 4 or 5 years. The Impressionism is about to start. And it has more of that, but this is not plein air painting. This is not outdoor painting. This is still a studio painting, but he would still go outside and do studies just like the other earlier landscape painters did, but then go back to the studio. But there's a sense of light here. I love his works. They have a physical reality to them that he believed was important in realism. I mean, he wrote a manifesto in 1861 where he said, painting is an essentially concrete art and can only consist in the representation of real and existent things. It is wholly physical language, which uses visible objects instead of words. The abstract, invisible, and non-existent lies outside the scope of painting. And he's very famous for having said, if I ever see an angel, I'll paint one. That's it. It's physical, it's concrete. I want this thing in front of me, then I'll paint it. Don't ask me to do anything else. So that's also an important sort of stance on art. Everybody loves that quote about an angel. I mean, that's a pretty profound thing to say. I mean, it took somebody who's pretty self-confident to say something like that as well at that time. But note these are smaller, 3 by 4 feet. Something that is more likely to be acceptable. Okay, now what happens to Courbet? What is his how does it end for Courbet and the Second Empire? Second Empire ends in 1870 in a bizarre, I mean, if you thought these earlier periods were bizarre, they're nothing compared to what happens in 1870 and 71. Napoleon III is spending his time in the Second Empire attempting to restore the great empire of Bonaparte. He's trying to capture other countries. He thinks he's Napoleon. He's not. He's just got the name Napoleon. He is not Napoleon. Napoleon was his great uncle. He's not the same guy. He starts this war. He's heading in, trying to recapture Germany. And within 2 months, he's captured. Literally 2 months into the war, he's out on the battlefield and they capture it. For all intents and purposes, that's it. So he's captured. 2 days later, 2 days after he's captured, he's deposed in Paris. He has like that much support. He's gone, revolution, let's set up a real republic. And they do. They actually, for the first time, have a true republic in Paris. The problem is, France, because he's captured, France ends up surrendering to Germany, but Paris refuses to surrender. France surrenders, Paris won't. And so you've got German troops surrounding Paris and French troops surrounding Paris, trying to get the Parisians to surrender. Instead, the socialists all get together and say, let's set up a socialist government just for the city of Paris, and they call it the Paris Commune. Paris Commune lasts from March to May of 1871, and they're completely besieged and surrounded. There's nothing going in. They're starving to death within a very short period of time. They're eating rats. There are all these stories about them eating the rats of Paris. They really clean up the city because they're starving to death. 10 to 20,000 people in the city die. It was like the dumbest idea ever. But it's so French. It's such a French idea. It's such a Parisian idea that it fails. Courbet is part of that commune. He's in the city. He is a socialist. He was made commissioner of the arts. And he was warned that he was personally responsible for all the art in Paris. And one of the acts of the communards, as they were known, one of the acts was to pull down this Vendôme column. The Vendôme column is just this freestanding column in the city of Paris. And I think Napoleon III had put it up, and it was a symbol of the empire. So these communards decide this has got to go. So they pull this column down. So it ends. The army comes back in and they set up the Republic again. They wanted to do, and they go to Courbet and said, "You owe us for this column. You let this be destroyed." So he got 6 months in jail, and they sent him the bill. A huge amount of money he owed, which he couldn't deal with. So when he got out of jail, he went into exile. He left. He went to Switzerland and spent the rest of his life in Switzerland because they sent him the bill for the Vendôme column. You know, it's like, if this weren't real, no one would believe this story about France. I mean, the French finally get it together in 1871. They finally set up a stable republic. It's called the Third Republic. And finally, we have stability. It lasts until World War II, when the Germans invade. Then they become part of the Third Reich. After that falls, they establish what's called the Fourth Republic, and that's where they are now. So they are now in the Fourth Republic.
Didn't Germany come into existence in that?
Yes, yes.
Now, what did that do with art in Germany?
It was great. It was great. Well, they were fine before in art. It didn't change the art that much, but it was, Germany is unified. The one thing that came out, actually both Napoleons, there were positive results in Germany after both Napoleons, after they finally were defeated. After this Napoleon, Germany was about 20 different nation states before, but when they were attacked in the Franco-Prussian War, that brought them together, right? They all came together, and that was a really positive thing, that they were unified, more or less unified. You know, after they defeated the French, they were still like 4 or 5 different nations, and Austria was separated at that time, but that's better than 20 different nations. You know, it helped to unify them to a great extent. You still had Prussia and 2 or 3 other states, but yeah, it was very positive. Germany, when we're going to talk a lot more about Germany in the spring when we get to the 20th century, because we're going to continue this in the spring. Germany is very different inherently from France in the art world, in that the French always had one center, and that was Paris. I mean, that was it. Paris was the center of the art world. Germany has never had a single center. Even now that it's one country, there are 5 or 6 places, you know, Munich is an art center, Berlin's an art center, Freiburg is an art center. There are 5 or 6 places that have thriving centers of art and have their own sort of styles. So it's different in that way. And another difference between not only Germany, but England and America is, while all the other countries had their own version of an academy, you know, some sort of institution. Germany had several. There's the Munich Academy, the Berlin Academy, but none of those academies were ever as controlling as the French Academy. It's totally different. You don't have, you know, these kind of rebellions. This is going to be important really in the next couple of classes, because, you know, because of the control of the French Academy, you have the development of the avant-garde as an oppositional voice. But if you don't have anything to rebel against, you don't get the oppositional voice. So in Germany, in London, they're all working through their academy, everybody. So you don't have like this split between this academic and avant-garde group, which is why you get this French avant-garde. So this idea, we're going back to the Hegelian dialectic, this idea that opposition leads to growth, it leads to something new, something better. And that's happening in Paris. And it's all because of the academy. They're actually creating an avant-garde.
Now, you said earlier that the Americans would often come to Paris, and what about the Germans and the
Yeah.
Italians and the English?
Some.
The Paris was considered the top of
It's
the
where you
pecking
went.
order.
Yeah, in the Western world,
In-
Paris is the center of the Western art world until World War II. Even the whole first half of the 20th century, people went to Paris, and they came from Germany, Italy, they came from everywhere. We're going to encounter people from all over the Western world. Not only the Western world, there's a period where a lot of Japanese artists come to Paris, but yeah, it will stay. It's World War II that changes that.
So World War One, that like I being a Hemingway fan and all these other guys, that lost generation that went to Paris.
Yeah,
In the literary world, the artistic world from mid 1800s on up was kind of like
even
that's where
earlier.
you go.
Even earlier. Yeah, once it was safe, after the French Revolution and everything settled down, I mean, we're talking Paris, so we got to say like relatively safe. They were going to Paris always, but a lot of Americans actually went to Germany as well. There was the Munich Academy was real popular, and a lot of Americans went to Germany because a lot of Americans were German. German speakers, German descendants. So, a lot went to Germany. A lot of the landscape painters went to Germany. When we looked at Bierstadt, Alfred Bierstadt, he was born in Germany. He was an American painter, but he went and studied in Germany and Munich and then came back to America again. So yes, a lot went to Germany, but Paris was really the place, that was the place you wanted to go. Yeah.
How about Russia?
In the 20th century, not till we get to that's another really interesting story that we'll deal with in the spring. Russian history is as bizarre as French, and it's got its own, there's nothing more interesting in the 20th century than Russian history and Chinese history. Both of them are kind of bizarre in the way they turn, but there will be Russians in Western Europe early in the 20th century, before the Russian Revolution even. A lot of them will go back to Russia at the time of the revolution and then come back. But there's a lot of interplay. Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg were very much on the forefront of the avant-garde in the early 20th century for a number of years, as we will see, especially while Lenin was in power. Because he was a great supporter of avant-garde art, and really Russian artists were some of the most progressive for a few years. Trotsky was a supporter as well. Man, Stalin gets in power, that's it. Crackdown. We'll talk all about that in the spring. But in Paris, yes, that was the place to be. Especially interesting, up to World War I. Things change, of course, after the war, a lot of changes.
I think this is a great way to learn history.
I agree. Why would you just learn dull history when you can look at pictures and put it into a context? Yeah.
Did you see that PBS series? I don't know how old it was now, of Eugen Weber from, I don't know whether it was UCLA. He's originally a Hungarian, but he did Western history, and he always used art.
To illustrate.
Figures, pyramids, Egyptian.
No, I didn't. There've been some great
tradition series.
Yeah. I've seen several of those. There have been some really great ones on PBS. What's wrong with PBS anyway? It went off the air. I mean,
It's their antenna.
There's something wrong with transmitter, transformer.
Wow.
I don't know, some kind of machine.
They said it'd be off for like maybe weeks.
Really? I hadn't heard.
When did
Ah,
that happen?
That's
Something broke.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
I just had all these, I automatically record so many things and started to watch them and it was like,
No,
nothing there, nothing there. Huh.
I wonder if they're part of the chip shortage like the automobile makers or something. They can't get
Who knows?
electronics.
Who knows? We're not gonna get to NIE today, but that's okay. Let me bring back our other people. Does anybody have anything else? I mean, we've been having some wonderful discussions. I hope you guys have been able to hear what's been going on. Do you have any contributions to that or questions or anything you want to talk about?
Oh, good job.
Thank you. It's an interesting, a really interesting period, and it just gets more so. I mean, we're moving into the second half is so much fun. I mean, this is what I love about the 19th century. So I can't wait to get into that. So next time, we'll probably look briefly at Millet, who we missed today. I'll just look at like one work by him, because I do want to give you sort of the rural counterpart to Courbet. We'll look at one or two pieces. And then we'll be turning to two of my all-time favorite artists. I can't wait. Manet and Degas, who are second generation realists. And there's so much happening. We're kind of going back to that Second Empire again. And these are the dominant artists of the 60s, and then later into the 70s. So
They
that's,
always put Manet in with the Impressionists.
yeah, they shouldn't do that.
I know.
Well, there's a relationship. I'll talk about that, but he's not an impressionist, but he knew them, he met with them, and there's influence, but it's not the same thing as being. Yeah, I know that it bothers me too. And when they do it with Degas, it bothers me even more. But yeah, they do. And I agree, it's irritating. So we'll clarify that next week. These two are not impressionists. There's a relationship going on there, but it's very different. Okay, well, I'll see everybody next week.